Right, welcome everyone to the first workshop of ICYD 2022. My name is Andrew. I'm one of the Chief Adjudicators of this competition, and I'm going to be presenting this workshop, which is going to be an introduction to BP debating. Let's just start off with some logistics. So this PowerPoint and a video recording of the workshop will be posted on the ICYD 2022 website, which you can see the link for on my screen. There will also be a more print-friendly text document version of this workshop. So if you would like printing things out, that's probably a better version to print out. Or if you prefer to read instead of watching a video, that might be better as well. The next thing is, please ask questions in the Zoom chat. That's one of the biggest benefits of attending these workshops live. We know that lots of people couldn't make it today because of exams and other commitments, and that's why we're recording these sessions. But we can't really answer your questions if you're not here on the day. So if you are here, please ask questions in the Zoom chat, and I will probably answer those as we go through the workshop. The final thing is, while these resources are being made publicly available, copyright still applies, so please don't sell them to other people for money. Let's get started on the debating then. An outline of today's workshop, since for ICYD, we're not really expecting anyone to have extensive debating experience beforehand. We're going to start with what is competitive debating and why debate. Then we're going to move on to the British Parliamentary debate format, which is the format that ICYD and a lot of other competitions use. After that, we'll go into the speaker roles of each speaker within a debate. We'll look briefly at points of information in style, and finally conclude with some information about ICYD 2022 and how that's going to run. So, starting with competitive debating. Little bit about what competitive debating is. It's a very structured activity, so it's not just people sitting down and talking to each other about some topics. It is very structured, and there are rules around who speaks at what time and how long for. That's just to keep it very orderly. You will argue for or against a motion in teams. So debates are centered around motions, which are statements that you might agree or not agree with. And as a team, your job will be to argue for or against that motion. Like most competitive debating competitions, you will be allocated sides. So you will be told whether you need to argue for or against a motion. You won't get to choose that yourself. So quite often you might find that you're arguing for a position that you don't necessarily believe in yourself. That's completely fine. It might be a little bit difficult at first, but it's a really useful skill to have and develop. The aim within a competitive debate is to be more persuasive in relation to the motion within the rules of the format. So you want to win the debate, and the way to do that is you have to be more persuasive than the other teams in the debate. But while you're doing that, you still have to be relevant to the motion and follow the rules of the format. And this will be assessed by adjudicators, multiple or singular, depending on how many there are. They will decide the result of the debate. There are lots of different formats of competitive debating, including WSDC, which is what's used for the World Schools Debating Championships, and BP, which stands for British Parliamentary, and that's the format that we use for ICYD, and also the vast majority of university competitions and other competitions run by universities, such as the Oxford Schools competition. So let's now have a look at motions, because these are the statements that we are debating when it comes to competitive debating. So motion is just a statement you're debating, and by convention, these will start off something like this house something. So it might be this house would do something, this house believes that something, this house supports, this house opposes, this house prefers, this house regrets, this house as an individual or a group would do something. So those are all possible motions. And we've got a couple of examples here. So this house would make it compulsory for students to take part in team sport as a motion that we might debate. This house believes that mass tourism does more harm than good. There's a typo there, I'll fix that later. More harm than good in developing countries is another motion. This House prefers government decisions to be made by experts in specific fields, e.g. health, education, environment, justice, instead of elected politicians. So you can find very long lists of motions. I've just put 3 here. So you have some idea of the various issues that we might debate as debaters. And there really is a variety from education to international relations, economics, politics, and social issues. So why should we debate before we get into the rest of the presentation? I hope you have lots of reasons because you've chosen to take part in debating. But here's just a couple more that I came up with. The first of these is that it's fun. I find it personally a very enjoyable activity. I know lots of other people do as well. You can make friends. There's a huge sense of achievement when you do well, and you learn a lot as well. There are also lots of really useful skills that you can gain, develop, and practice through debating. So things like confidence and public speaking skills, critical thinking and reasoning skills. And these things will be really useful for a lot of your school subjects and even at university, be that when you're applying, if you have to sit through an Oxford interview, or at the universities themselves when you write essays or whatever. And I think the other thing about debating is it makes you a lot more aware of the world around you. So it gives you a greater awareness of social issues. Quite often you'll come across topics that you might have never thought about before. And that's really going to help you come across these things and learn a bit more about them in a really cool and interesting way. Okay, before I move on to the BP debating format, are there any questions so far? I'll give you a moment. It seems not. Please feel free to type questions at any time during the presentation, and I will answer those. Okay, let's move on to the British Parliamentary or BP debating format. So this is one of many debating formats. It's perhaps the most common. So it's used for almost every university debating competition and a lot of schools competitions as well, including ICYD, which is one you're taking part in, hopefully, and Oxford Schools, which is a really big schools competition that the Oxford Union also runs. Now, the really unusual thing about British parliamentary debating that's unique to this format is instead of having just 2 teams, you actually have 4 teams in a BP debate. Each team consists of 2 speakers, and because there's 4 teams, there will be 2 teams that we call government teams speaking for the motion, and the other 2 teams we'll call the opposition teams, and they will speak against the motion. The motion within a BP debate is announced just 15 minutes before the debate itself. That sounds really scary, but you'll get used to it over time. While you're preparing, you're not allowed to use the internet, teachers or coaches to help you. That would just be unfair. We also sort of want to see your ability to come up with arguments yourself and explain things in a logical way, rather than searching the internet for people to searching the internet for arguments that other people have already made, which doesn't really show too much thinking skills on yourself. With online debating, the rule around the internet has changed a little bit. So you can't search the internet for information or get help via the internet, but you can, of course, like use Zoom if your debate's held on Zoom. You can also use things like Google Docs if you want to communicate with your partner during the debate, or if you just find that a bit easier to show and each other and collaborate when preparing your work. Speeches are up to 5 minutes long for ICYD, so that's just means that if you keep speaking after 5 minutes, we won't really consider your contributions, or 7 minutes in the case of university, most university tournaments, but we don't need to worry about that there. Why are there 2 teams on each side? This is a question that I've received. This is a little bit difficult to answer. It's one of the things that's quite inherent to the BP format. But as we'll see in a moment, One of the really interesting parts of this is that because you have two teams on each side, you can get a greater range of ideas and arguments for each side of the motion. And that can be really interesting to see as well. Moving on to the four teams within BP debate. And I know there's a lot of information that we're throwing at you quite quickly, which is why don't worry if you don't write all of this down, since we are going to give you the PowerPoint and the notes after. That will be sent to your teachers who registered your teams, and you'll be able to refer to that if you don't catch this all the first time. In terms, before I move on, there's a question about whether speakers don't necessarily need specific facts. Yes, that's correct. So because we don't allow you to use the internet to research very specific situations, we don't expect you to know like very specific statistics or things like that. Examples can be useful, but they're not necessarily expected unless they're really well known. So I think the usual standard that we apply is you should probably be reading the front page of a newspaper, or at least the headlines of the BBC. Or something like that. So for example, I think earlier this year, there was a lot of news about Afghanistan or a lot of news about COVID. So those are things that we might expect you to know a little bit about. But if it were to be very specific things happening in the world, perhaps the conflict in Ethiopia at the moment, at least at the ICYD level, we really wouldn't expect you to know a whole lot about those situations. And sometimes if there's a lot of specific information that you need in order to engage with the motion, we will provide an information slide as well, which is just a few sentences of information that's relevant to the debate. So one of the things that we are going to discover with BP debating is that it's not who can recite the most facts or do the most research on the internet, or even if that's the focus or some other formats, but rather who's able to take the things that they know and form some really coherent and well-explained arguments based on that. All right, let's go into the four teams within BP. So we've got first team's called Opening Government, which we write OG for short. Then we have Opening Opposition, OO for short, Closing Government, CG for short, and Closing Opposition, CO for short. So as we've noticed here, there are two government teams who argue for the motion and two opposition teams who argue against the motion. There are also two opening teams, which are on the first half of the debate chronologically, and two closing teams who are in the second half of the debate chronologically. And the thing with BP is that even though there's two teams on each side, you are trying to beat all three other teams, including the one on your side. So if you're opening government, you want to beat OO, CO, and also CG instead of just OO and CO. And if you are a closing team in BP, even though you want to beat your opening team, you can't contradict them. You can't say that they were wrong. You just have to provide better arguments in a better case. The result of the debate, which we call the call, is a ranking of all four teams from first to fourth. And this can happen in any order, which makes 24 possible calls. That's a maths problem that I'll leave to you. So you can have any call. You can have opening government in first, opening opposition in second, closing government in third, closing opposition in fourth. We don't decide that one side wins the debate and then two teams on that side get first and second. You can get any order between the four teams of who's getting first, second, third, and fourth. So there are 24 possible orders at the end of that. Speaking order, and again, no pressure to write this down. We've got a really nice picture on the next page for you. So it's a little bit, a lot to take in at first, but all of the speakers within BP have their special names. So the two speakers on opening government are the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. The two speakers on opening opposition are called the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. They've all got abbreviations here as well. The two speakers on closing government are called the Government Member and the Government Whip. And the two speakers on closing opposition are called the Opposition Member and Opposition Whip. So this is the order that they speak in, and all of which teams they're on, their names and their abbreviations. There's a diagram on the next page that makes this a lot clearer. You shouldn't need to worry too much about the speaking order. Firstly, because it is fairly logical, it just alternates between the two sides, as we're about to see. And secondly, because the chair judge in each debate will thank each speaker for their speech and then call up the next speaker. So you don't really need to memorize this yourself, and you'll get the hang of this after a debate or two. So here's a diagram of what's happening, which also shows how you might set up a debate room if you were doing a BP debate in person. So you have the adjudicator or adjudicators at the back of the room. You have the government teams on the left of the adjudicators. You have the opposition teams on the right of the adjudicators. And that's where you sit during the debate with your partner. And to speak, you go up to the table, and while speaking, you look at the adjudicators rather than the other teams. This also shows the speaking order, hopefully in a slightly clearer way. It's PM, LO, DPM, DLO, GM, OM, GW, OW. So it just alternates between the two sides, with the two opening teams debating before the two closing teams. So that's the speaking order within BP, and how you might set up a room if there are enough tables, essentially. Right. Do we have any questions on this before we move on to exactly what each speaker does within the debate? How about if the team goes second? Yeah, we will. So the question is, what happens if your team goes second and you don't want to repeat the points made by the first team? So we'll do an entire workshop on this. I think the plan is for the third workshop to be about what to do on closing and how to extend. But I think the really short answer is you just need to brainstorm a greater variety of points during preparation time, and then based on what happens within the debate, you want to choose the ones that haven't been said and are most relevant, and then present those. Let's just run through the speaker roles, since this is a bit boring, but something you do need to know to follow the rules of BP debating. So starting off the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. Your role here is to basically introduce and develop your team's case. One possible way you can do this, and this is just like, it's a bit of a formula, you don't have to follow it, but it is just to give you an idea of how you might spend your time. So you have your introduction, which is exactly what you think it is. Then you define a motion. We'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. You flag your points. So you just say, maybe I have 3 points. My first point is this, my second point is that. If you're the leader of the opposition, you might want to do a little bit of rebuttal. And rebuttal just means responses to the points made by the other team. That's why the Prime Minister, being the first speaker in the debate, can't really do rebuttal. So you respond to the other team's points, you explain why they're wrong, essentially. After that, you have the main part of your speech, which are your substantive points. You might have 2 of them if you're the Prime Minister, and you finish with a conclusion, which is exactly what it sounds like. So let's have a look at, and these are some rough timings for how much time you want to spend on each thing. Generally, you want to focus on your substantive points. You can see that's where you want to spend the majority of your time, because that's what's going to develop your team's case and what's going to deliver you to win. Question, should we start by repeating the motion, saying which speaker we are, etc.? No, you don't need to do that. The reason is because before the debate starts, the judge will read out the motion and also ask everyone for their names, which position they're speaking in, and gender pronoun preference, if any. So it's not necessary to say the motion, your name, which speaker you are at the start of your speech. In fact, we would advise that you don't need to do that because it doesn't achieve anything for your side. And it also uses up some of your time that you might be able to spend making other arguments. Right. So that's just like a rough structure of what you might do as the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition in your speech. You don't need to follow this very strictly. You can play around with this. You might only have 1 really big point. You might have 3 smaller points, and then you can just adjust the timings appropriately. Right. Next slide. Defining the motion. this is a little bit technical, but basically whenever you're proposing a policy in a debate, you need to make it clear what you're supporting and how that policy works. We'll see an example of this on the next slide. When you're doing this, you need to be reasonable. You should follow what we call the spirit of the motion. So you should read the motion as what like a normal person might understand it to mean. You shouldn't come up with very extreme or creative readings of the motion, even if you feel like that would be very strategic, because the chances are you're probably not really defending the actual motion and you'll be caught out by that. You don't, in BP at least, you don't need to give the dictionary definitions of words and emotion. The vast majority of the time, people will know what words and emotion mean, so especially if they're not controversial. You don't need to spend like a half a minute, a full minute just reading out the dictionary definitions. That doesn't really help you. And you don't really need to spend that much time defining the motion, although if it's unclear, you'll need to spend a bit more time. The reason for this is if you spend like a minute or two just defining the motion, you're not going to have too much time left to actually make arguments. And in a debate, this is the responsibility of the two opening teams, so OG and OO. CG and CO, the two closing teams in a debate, must follow the definition set out by the opening teams. So however OG sets out the debate, CG has to defend it, and CO has to defend how OO has defined the debate. Let's see an example of this. So back to one of the motions that I mentioned briefly at the start of this workshop, this House would make it compulsory for students to take part in a team sport. So how might opening government define this motion? So I think we all understand what compulsory means, what team sport is. Maybe there's a little bit of ambiguity around exactly what students mean, so maybe you want to clear that up. So an OG, or specifically if you're the Prime Minister, you might say things like this applies to students from year 1 to year 10. They can choose which sport they want to participate in and whether they want to do this at school, at a club. Because we're the government and we're implementing this motion, we're going to make it free or we're going to subsidise it, so that's not going to be a problem. And you need to attend both the trainings and the games. So that's, I think, a fairly reasonable model for this. It's not too long and it's also pretty clear how you're implementing this policy, what it looks like in practice. And once OG has set out this definition, CG must follow this definition in the debate. How might opening opposition stand in a debate? So defining the motion isn't just the job of opening government. Opening opposition should also make it clear what they would support. And quite often when opening government is proposing a policy that changes what the world looks like, opposition will just stand for the world that we currently have, which we call the status quo, and that's the world without the motion. So if we again look at this motion of this House would make it compulsory for students to take part in a team sport, OO might just say, we prefer a world where it's not compulsory for students to do team sport. However, they can still choose to take part in team sport if they want to, and we can fund the activities as well so that they're affordable. And once OO has set up the debate in this way, closing opposition must follow this definition for the rest of the debate. So that's defining the motion. We've given you a few examples. I think the main thing to remember here is just to make it clear what the policy actually looks like, but don't get too caught up in this because while it's useful, it's not going to win you the debate, which is the next part on substantive arguments. Moving on to substantive points. So this is really the meat or the most important part of your so what are substantive points? We'll go through this in more detail next week when we talk about preparing cases. But basically, these are a good reason to support or oppose the motion. Quite often, this will be a benefit in the case of teams on side government, or a harm in the case of teams on side opposition of the motion. If you've done a lot of persuasive writing within school, you can think of this as like a body paragraph in persuasive writing. So let's go back to our compulsory team sport example. The Prime Minister might have 2 substantive points, and I've just come up with some of them over here. The first one might be on the interpersonal skills that you get from team sport. So cooperation, teamwork, communication with other people. And the second one might be about health benefits like fitness and leading a healthier lifestyle if you do take part in sport. So that might be the 2 points of Prime Minister. Obviously, you'll need to explain these in a bit more detail, but that's what the Prime Minister might run among many other options within this debate as substantive points. Okay, I think now we're up to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, our deputy speeches. So the role at a very high level of deputy speakers is to rebut the opposing team's case, to defend your team's case, and to add to your team's case. So possible structure for this, just to give you an idea of what you're doing and sort of the time allocation between different things, is you'd start with an introduction, you have a quick outline of your speech. So you might say, I'm going to have 2 points of rebuttal, firstly on this thing that OG said, secondly on this thing that OG said, and then I'm going to have a substantive point about this thing. You probably want to spend about half of your speech or a little bit more than that on rebuttal, and then you have a bit of time to spend on another substantive point, or depending on how heavily attacked your case has been, you can spend some time just re-explaining the parts of your case that have been attacked quite heavily if you think that's necessary. And as usual, you finish with your conclusion. So that's Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of the Opposition. So if, for example, the Prime Minister here has already talked about interpersonal skills and health benefits, maybe the Deputy Prime Minister is going to talk about personal skills, such as resilience or character development and personal growth that you might be able to get from team sports. And so that's roughly what people do on top half. The Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition spend most of their speeches delivering material. When it comes to the deputies, it's about half rebuttal, a little bit more than half rebuttal, and then some rebuilding or a new substantive point. Right. Let's move on then to the bottom half or the closing half of a debate. Starting with the member speeches, so the government member and the opposition member. Your job here is to extend a debate by providing something that's meaningfully new and significant. And we call these contributions extensions. So possible structure for your speech, you'd have your introduction, you'd outline your speech. So maybe like 1 quick point of rebuttal, then 2 extensions, 1 on this, 2 on that. And you want to spend a majority of your speech delivering your extension, because in the vast majority of cases, that's what will decide whether you win the debate or not. And the whip speaker is not allowed to bring in new analysis. We'll see that in a moment. You can do a little bit of rebuttal, but it's not as important in the debate. We have a question. Should we be more worried about doing everything on the list or just generally bring up good points of rebuttal? I think just the first one. So these structures, the reason why I've labeled them possible structures in bold is that they're just to give you a rough idea of the sorts of things that you might want to do within your speeches. So if you run out of time to do a conclusion, you can just spend it finishing off your second extension and then finish with like, and that's why we're really proud to support the motion. That's completely fine. So you don't need to check off all of these things. If you don't state your points, that's not going to lose you the debate. It'll just make you like very slightly harder to follow. The important part here is, I think the more important part here is to make sure that your analysis and explanations of your points, or in this case, your extensions, are really good. So that's member speeches. I think we have an example of extensions. So back to this debate about compulsory team sport. So perhaps opening government has already talked about interpersonal skills, health benefits, personal character and growth. Closing government needs to come up with some new material. So maybe opening opposition in this debate says that actually, if you force students to take part in team sport, they're not going to enjoy it very much. They're not going to participate properly. They're not going to get the sorts of benefits that OG is trying to claim. So in that case, you might want to run an extension explaining exactly why students will enjoy team sport. And you can come up with some reasons for that, such as how it's fun, how they'll be doing it with their friends, how people will be encouraging, and then what the long-term benefits of that are going to be, specifically that because people enjoy it, they're going to keep doing team sport, which then means that they get all of these interpersonal skills, health benefits, and so on, not just when they're a child, but as they become adults for the rest of their lives. Maybe you have another point about a greater variety of sport, not just being really competitive, because that's not what everyone wants. You might have more social sport, you might have more less popular sports becoming more popular as a result of this policy and individuals taking part in them. So those are just some examples of how, even if OG has taken all of the fairly obvious material within the debate, you still can try to come up with an extension of something that's meaningfully new. We have a question. Can participants bring up personal anecdotal information or things specific to their school or experiences? Yeah, you can. The thing about examples, and we'll see a bit more of this next week when we talk about analysing points or explaining points, is that examples are really useful to illustrate something. But the thing to be really careful of here is that you still want to explain what's happening in the example and why this is something that might be happening generally or on a larger scale. Because if you only state an example of your personal experience, that might just be something that only you have experienced, rather than something that a lot of people have experienced. So examples are really useful to illustrate something, including personal anecdotes if you want to include them, but you want to make sure that you explain what's happening and why that is something that's true in general for a lot of people. Okay. Moving on to the final speeches within the debate, which are our whip speeches. So your government whip and opposition whip. What you want to do as a whip speaker is to summarise the debate in a way that's very favourable to your team. So you're not trying to win the debate for your side, you're specifically trying to win the debate for your team. So for example, if you're closing government in a debate, you shouldn't be using responses from opening government or repeating responses from opening government to take down material from opposition teams, because even if you do that, it just gives more credit to opening government rather than you. So you want to make sure that you prioritise your team's material, your team's responses, and your team's extensions within whip speeches. Now, there are a couple of rules about what you can do and what you can't do in a whip speech. And essentially, you can't have a new substantive point or a material that's significantly new. The reason for this is because the whip speakers are the last speakers within a debate, and if you bring out a whole new point this late, and it just doesn't really give other teams enough of a chance to respond. So that's why the rules of BP debating tell us that you cannot bring in new substantive points or very significantly new material during a whip speech. However, everything else is allowed. So you can come up with new responses to arguments that other teams have made. You can come up with new analysis for arguments that your team has already made. So for example, if your member has stated an argument and only done a little bit of explanation on it, you can give a lot more explanation about why it's true, why it's important, all of that. You can have new weighing, which is explanations of why the certain material, ideally the material that your team has brought, is really important within the debate relative to that of other teams. And all of these things, new responses, new analysis, and new weighing, they're allowed, and we expect to see them from whip speeches. As for the structure of a whip speech, there are lots of different ways you can do this. The two most common ways to structure whip speeches is you can structure it around the other teams. So you can go, closing opposition said these things, here is how we beat them. Opening opposition said these things, here's how we beat them. Opening government said these things, here's how we beat them. So that's one way to structure your speech, a whip speech around just the other teams in the debate. And the other way, or the other main way, or structure that I see being used a lot, is to summarize the debate into some main areas of clash, or the main issues, or the main questions within the debate. And there might be any number of those. Now, you don't have to stick to one or another. It's up to you. Both of these can be quite effective. There are also speakers who, depending on what happens within the debate, switch between the two. we have a question. Will students be competing against students from their own school, or will each debate be composed from 4 teams from different schools? Yeah, so I think how it works at regional rounds is the draw generation tries to avoid teams debating other teams from the same school. But it's not like, it doesn't always do this because of other rules about how the draw is drawn and giving people different positions and things like that. So most of the time you'll be debating against teams from other schools. I can't guarantee that you won't debate for any students from your own school, but the draw will try to ensure that most of the time you are debating against different schools, because of course that just gives more value to your students, right? Okay. Let's get back to this structure of whip speeches. So introduction, outline as usual. You probably say whether you're doing this team by team. So you might say first on OO, second on CO, third on OG. And then you'd spend some time on each team or clash. And how much time you spend on it might depend on whether you're particularly trying to win that clash or how important it is to the debate. And then you finish with your conclusion. So for a clash-based whip, for example, I think back in this team sport debate from government whip, you might have 2 questions. The first being whether students will enjoy team sport. And then secondly, how does this affect students and sport in general? And if you do it by clash, under each question, you'd mention what the other teams have said in a debate, what your team has said, and then do a bit more explanation of why your responses and your team's contributions are particularly strong and mean that your team deserves to win the debate. Okay, so that's all on speaker roles. That's a lot to take in, but I think it is important to know, because if you do a whole new point in your whip speech, you're just not going to get the credit for it. And if you don't really compare yourself as the closing team to your opening team, it can be somewhat difficult to beat them. So it is important to know your rough roles. Essentially, the earlier in the debate, the more substantive you're doing, the later you are, the more rebuttal, responses, weighing, those sorts of things you're doing. And you can check back on the PowerPoint, on the notes, etc. For summaries of this. Moving on then to points of information, which is something that exists in a lot of debating formats. So what points of information, or POIs for short, are, is a short comment or a question that has to be under 15 seconds. You can offer these between 1 minute and 4 minutes of a speaker's speech. So this is why you'll typically see people on Zoom typing 1 or 4 in the chat, or back in person debating, people might bang on the table or ring a bell or wave their hand or clap or something like that. You can offer points of information to speakers on the opposing side, so only teams on the opposing side. So if you're opening government, you can only give and receive points of information from OO and CO. You can't give a POI to another team on the same side. And when you're offered a POI as a speaker, you can accept or decline the POI. If you decline the POI, they need to just sit down and they can offer it again later. If you accept the POI, they just ask you the question and then you respond to it. So why do we have points of information? They're a great way to show engagement with other teams, especially teams in the other half of the debate, and showing how you can respond on your feet. All teams should offer points of information, and all speakers should take 1 or 2 points of information. You can do this strategically, so you might wish to take points of information from diagonal teams. So those are the ones located diagonally to you. The seating plan that we saw earlier. So OG might want to take POIs from CO in order to engage with them more, since they get to hear OO speeches but not CO, and so on within the debate. Or if there's a team on the opposing bench that you're trying to defeat in particular, you might want to take more POIs from them if you think you'll be able to respond to those well. So logistically, how do points of information work? So in person debating, what you do is you stand up, you raise your hand, you say point or POI or on that point or something like that. And then the speaker might say yes, they might say no, or they might just wave you down if they don't want to disrupt the flow of your speech. For an online environment, what you should do is you should respect the speaker's preferred way of receiving POIs. And this is sort of the consensus that has come about because everyone's on different forms of technology and some things are easier for certain people. So before your speech, you might want to state your POI preference. So that might be receiving points of information via the Zoom chat. So you might type something in a Zoom chat saying POI OG, which means that you're offering a POI from OG, which is your team. Maybe they'll request that you open your camera and visibly raise your hand or sign, or some speakers might request verbal interruptions. But generally, we ask you to respect whatever preferred way that speakers state and default to the Zoom chat and not verbal interruptions if they don't say anything. The speaker might say yes, they might say no. In online debating, because you don't really see them as easily, quite often speakers will just ignore you. It's a little bit unfortunate, but you can't interrupt if they're just ignoring your POI. And in many cases, speakers will actually find it more convenient online to ask for a POI at some point, which you can do. You might just stop at just before 4 minutes and say, are there any POIs from OG? And then they might offer you one then. Question, if I'm not comfortable with taking POIs, do I have to take them? No, we are not forcing you to take POIs. It's not compulsory. You can always decline them. But we do quite strongly encourage you to take points of information because we think it is really helpful to show engagement and also helps you develop the skill of thinking on your feet. So I think the thing to keep in mind here, if you're a little bit nervous about points of information, is I guess firstly you might want to do a little bit of practice outside before the tournament. So maybe your teachers would be able to arrange a mini debate at school, or maybe they might be able to arrange a session where you and a partner just ask each other questions about a topic and then you try to respond in a sentence or two. So that might be useful. They are quite scary to start off with, I know, but we do encourage you to do a bit of practice and hopefully take one or two of these when it comes to the tournament itself. I think in the very worst situation, you can always respond with something that along the lines of, well, I've responded to this already in my case, or that's a good point, my next speaker is going to deal with this. Those aren't the best responses to a POI because it does show that you're not really engaging with it. But that's, in the worst case, you can just move on or something like that. So essentially, it's not compulsory to take POIs, but we do strongly encourage it. Right. Some examples. So back to this motion of compulsory team sport, because that's a theme for this workshop. So I've got two POIs here from OO to OG, one a bit shorter, one a bit longer, one that ends with a question, one that doesn't. So we've got this first POI, which is probably getting close to 15 seconds, where OO points out that all additional participation in team sport under this motion comes from students who actively choose not to at the moment. These students don't want to do team sport, they won't participate properly, and they won't get the benefits we play. So this is POI from OO to OG that sort of attacks the case that OG is presenting around all of these interpersonal or health benefits that come from team sport. And OO here is basically saying that, well, if these students don't play properly, they're not going to get those benefits. So if you get a POI like this, you should respond. I think the response from OG might just be some analysis either on why students would enjoy team sport when they're forced to do so. Maybe it's because they've just never tried it before. Maybe it's because everyone's really supportive. Or you could respond with some analysis around how these benefits still exist, even if you don't enjoy it that much. If you play sport, you're still exercising, you still get the health benefits, even if you don't enjoy it, right? So you can come up with some responses to this. Usually you only want to spend 15, 30 seconds responding to a POI, unless you're short for time, in which case you can spend longer. But that hopefully gives you some ideas to how POIs work. Another example here that's a little bit shorter, OO might say to OG, what do you say to the students who inevitably let their team down and feel really sad as a result and maybe even get bullied? So then OG would have to respond to this. Maybe they'll just say that, well, You can have social team sport where this isn't so much of an issue. If you play together as a team for a really long time, you're likely to be supportive of anyone because that's how your team does really good in the future. And if there is really bullying, then the teachers or the coaches or whoever can step in and prevent that from happening. So even if the questions do feel a little bit difficult to respond to at first, hopefully with a bit of practice, you should be able to respond to these POIs a little bit better. Question, can POIs be given to all speakers or are the two closing speakers excluded? So you can give POIs to anyone on the opposite side. So if you're an OG, you can give POIs to OO and CO. If you're CG, you can give POIs to OO and CO. If you're OO, you can give POIs to OG and CG. If you're CO, you can give POIs to OG and CG. So whether you're opening or closing doesn't matter when it comes to POIs. You can just give POIs to the opposite side of the debate, whether they're closing or opening. All right. So hopefully that gives us a bit more understanding about how points of information work. Right. Finally, some quick remarks on style. And what we mean by style is how arguments are delivered beyond the content of the arguments themselves. So unlike some other formats, such as WSDC, where you're explicitly marked with style, style's not a huge part of BP debating, which tends to focus more on the quality of your arguments and how well explained they are. However, it's another typo here which I'll fix. Style can still affect how persuasive you are. So what do we consider when it comes to style? We don't consider subjective aspects such as speaker's accent, because that would be quite discriminatory. However, we do consider aspects such as voice, tone, your use of language, the choice of words you use, and the speed that you speak at. So I think speakers are more interesting to listen to if they vary their tone. If you're talking about a very serious situation, your tone should suit that. If you speak really, really fast and no one can understand you, that's going to hurt your case as well. So be aware of these things. It's not the biggest focus of BP debating, but style can affect how persuasive you are. Okay, I think that's the end of the BP section of this workshop. We're going to finish with just a little bit about how ICYD runs, including this year. So as you probably know already, ICYD is the international competition for young debaters. In England and Wales, that means you have to be in year 10 or below. In other places, it means you have to be aged 15 or below 31st of August next year, 2022. So that's the eligibility rules for participating in ICYD. As we've mentioned lots of times already, it's held in a BP format, which we spent most of today looking at. And it's hosted alternatingly by the Oxford and Cambridge unions. So last year it was run by Cambridge. This year it's being run by the Oxford Union again. And the structure of the competition is that we start with regional rounds and then there's a finals day that the top teams will get to attend. As for regional rounds, most of the time this will be one day, probably a Saturday or a Sunday. You'll probably get to speak in 3 debates, and about the top 15% of teams will qualify for finals day. As you can see, there are lots of asterisks here. So those numbers may vary depending on how they've been organised, especially for international rounds where the local organisers have a bit more flexibility about how they would like to run their local round. For each debate, what will happen is the draw will be released. So the draw is just the list of matchups of who's debating with who, which side you're on, or actually no, which team you are within the debate, whether that's OG, OO, CG, or CO. After the draw is released, there will be a motion announcement. So someone will read the motion out, or if it's online, they'll probably post the motion somewhere. After that, you have your 15 minutes of preparation time, and then you have your debate, which probably takes about an hour. After the debate, the judges will deliberate. That might take 5 to 15 minutes, depending on how close the debate is and how many judges there are. Then the judges will come back and they will give you the oral adjudication. So that usually takes about 10 minutes. And in the oral adjudication, the judge will give you the result. and they will also explain to you why the judges saw the debate the way they did and why the teams placed in the order that they did. After the oral adjudication, you can approach the judges for individual feedback and team feedback. This is optional, but we still highly recommend it because that's how you're going to get better as a speaker. So that's just a rough run through of how each debate works. You'll do probably 3 of these at your regional round, and hopefully you really enjoy that. If you do really well, then you'll get to go through to finals day at the end of this. And finally, looking at the ICYD 2022 dates, we've got the domestic dates here. You can ask the conveners for the dates of international rounds. So Oxford round will be the first one on Saturday, the 15th of January, and this will be a hybrid round. So you'll be able to attend this online or in person. KCL is hosting a round on the 6th of March, that will be online. UCL is doing a round on the 12th of March, which will be online. Scotland will be doing a round online. The date for that will be announced shortly. And there will likely be an additional online round in early February with the date to be announced. So as a school, you can choose which of these rounds you would want to take part in. And after all of this, finals day will take place on Sunday, the 24th of April. This will be at Oxford, and it will be a hybrid competition. So if you'd like to attend in person, you can. If it's hard for you to travel over, you can also attend online. All right, that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for coming today. If you have questions, keep typing them in the Zoom chat. I'll have a read of them in a moment. So the plan, as I think the conveners has told you, is that there will be 4 of these workshops. There will be another one next week about preparing cases and making points. Then there'll be a break for Christmas and New Year's. I think we resume the first week of January. The conveners will be in touch with the exact date to talk about closing and extensions, and there'll be a 4th workshop the week after that as well. So there'll be a series of workshops, and we've done that just so for students who haven't done very much debating before, we thought we could go through more interesting parts of debating with more examples in detail if we split it up into 4 workshops that cover different things rather than just going through the same thing 4 times. So thank you for coming. Hopefully you've enjoyed that. Let's just have a read of these questions in the Zoom chat. How can you ensure people aren't looking things up on the internet? This first question about how do we ensure that people don't look things up on the internet. So it is for a large part like an honor system, to be completely honest. But I think the other part of this is just, it can be very obvious when teams are just reading arguments that they found on the internet, or when they're citing incredibly specific examples that no one really is familiar with. I think in those sorts of situations, there may be an investigation. If there are reports of this, there may be an investigation, but also doing so is just not necessarily the most persuasive thing within BP, because most articles on the internet aren't set up for BP format, and it's not going to help you. So that's why you're not allowed to look up things on the internet, and it's also not really worth it. The next question then, if a school has 4 teams participating, should we all come into school and the teams split into classes, or can they log on individually? So I think this is a question about logistics of where teams can debate from. This is entirely up to you. So as a teacher, I'm assuming you can arrange for there to be like a few classrooms left open at school and for the teams to debate from there, if that's what they would prefer and it's convenient and feasible for you. You can also have the speakers debating just from their own homes online. The 2 speakers within a team might be in the same room, house, if they want to do that or not, if it's not feasible. So that's one of the big flexibilities of online debating. Any of those things can work. As a debater myself, I've spoken with my partner in the same room. I've spoken with my partner halfway around the world, where we've just had like a Google Doc that we've typed on in a video call during 15 minutes of preparation. So that's entirely up to you to decide as a teacher, how you might arrange that with your students. Okay, are there any other questions before I close up this meeting? In that case, thank you so much for coming. Really glad to hear that you found it useful. As I've mentioned before, we will be posting this on the ICYD website along with PowerPoint video notes, and we hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye and have a nice evening.